Yeah. All right, they're ready. And they're looking hard. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Seating looks to be at a premium here. Maybe if you have a seat and you don't need it, and somebody does need it, maybe you can give it up. Check your sitting privilege, maybe. My name is Micah Utrecht. I am an associate editor here at Jacobin. And thanks again for everyone for coming to this issue launch party for issue number 24, Journey to the Dark Side, which is available for sale in the back from our friends at Haymarket Books. You came in through the back. Yeah, there's waving back there, but you can't see them. There's so many damn people here. Yeah, John in the back has all the Jacobin books, several recent back issues, copies of the new issue, as well as a bunch of Haymarket titles, some of which we'll be talking about in a second. You're in the space for In These Times magazine. Jacobin rents an office here, but this building's owned by In These Times. So serious thank you to In These Times magazine. I'm not sure. Yeah, we can give a round of applause. In These Times is a national progressive magazine, lots of focus on social movements, particularly on the labor movement. And they're a real pillar of the Chicago progressive. We're co-sponsoring a book talk on Monday with Steve Early, who's a labor journalist, who just wrote a book called Refinery Town, Big Oil, Big Money, and the Remaking of an American City. That is on Monday at 6 p.m. at 57th Street Books. This book is on the Richmond Progressive Alliance, which is an independent political organization in Richmond that has done really amazing stuff that no one has ever even heard about, despite the fact that they've taken on that city's democratic machine and really won some incredible victories against both them and Chevron, one of the world's largest oil corporations. So he's going to be talking about that and what the lessons from Richmond are for the rest of the country, and especially for Chicago.
Richmond where?
Richmond, California. Yeah. Also here, again, that's on Monday. And then also here on March 16th, sociologist Mike McCarthy from Marquette University is giving a talk entitled "Why Your Boss Is Working You to Death." That was the less macabre version of that. I think we went through like why your boss wants you to die at your desk. He's going to be talking about the decline of welfare state protections and retirement since the New Deal. So that'll be here, March 16th at 6:30 p.m. And we also, on March 19th, the last one, we have a reading group, Jacobin. There's about 50 reading groups that meet around the country and around the world. And we have one that meets once a month here at In These Times. And that is on March 19th. I don't know what time, probably 11 a.m. on March 19th. We'll be talking about immigration and sanctuary cities, which is one of the things that we'll be discussing tonight. So please come to one of those events, all of those events. They'll be worth your time, I promise. So let me just start with introducing the panel that we have here, the esteemed, illustrious panel that we have. On the far end, we have Rory Fanning. Rory Fanning is a former Army Ranger who fought in Afghanistan, who was one of the first Army Rangers to become a conscientious objector to the wars in the Middle East. And Rory wrote a book about this, his experience in Afghanistan and his journey to becoming a war resistor called Worth Fighting For, An Army Ranger's Journey Out of the Military and Across America. And you can buy that at the back table. It's from Haymarket Books, where Rory works, I should say. Rory speaks to CPS classrooms on a regular basis about why you should not join the military. So if there are any educators in the room who would like someone like Rory to come speak to your class about such a thing, I'm sure Rory will be around afterwards for such a discussion. And then also, Rory wears many hats. He co-wrote a book that just came out, Craig Hodges, if anyone remembers Bulls in the 90s. Craig Hodges, the three-point shooter, right? Yeah. On Jordan and Pippen, and he was on the team. He co-wrote his memoir called Long Shot, The Triumphs and Struggles of an NBA Freedom Fighter, which is also for sale in the back. Next to Rory is R.L. Stevens. R.L. is a union organizer and researcher in Chicago. He was the founding editor of an online magazine called Orchestrated Pulse. He's also the co-host with me of a new podcast from Jacobin called Stockton to Malone. We just dropped our second episode yesterday. Features me discussing my years of speaking with extreme vocal fry to atone for my white privilege. And RL is how he is convinced that Obama tore the bowling alley out of the White House and replaced it with a basketball court, despite all facts to the contrary.
I choose to believe.
It's like the X-Files, it's like I want to believe. Talk about all kinds of stuff, so you can check us out on Jacobin Radio. It's again called Stockton to Malone. And then to his right is Michelle Gunderson, who is a first grade teacher at Nettlehorse Elementary. She is a steering committee of the caucus of steering committee member of the Caucus of Rank and File Educators, which is which is if you're wooing, then maybe you're already familiar with CORE. CORE is the caucus within the Chicago Teachers Union that took over in 2010, and there's actually a book in the back that is about this topic if you're interested. But she's also a trustee at the Chicago Teachers Union, as well as a PhD student in education at Loyola University. And she's a contributor to a book that just came out called Inside Schools, Teachers' Views of the Failures of Education Reform. There's a Jacobin article from a few years ago that was on standardized testing. I believe the first line of the article is, Michelle Gunderson hates standardized tests. So that's also an important biographical point. And then directly to my left is Carlos Rosa, who is the alderman of the 35th Ward, just northwest of here, right? I believe you're the youngest member of the city council, also the first openly gay Latino alderman. And before he won office, what was it, two years ago? 2 years ago?
Before.
Wow.
2 years ago.
2 years ago. Okay. Before that, you were a labor and immigrants' rights organizer in Chicago. All right, that's our panel. So this issue is, for folks who haven't had a chance to read it yet, it was an unexpected issue. We were planning to write about something totally different. We were going to write about Latin America, the pink tide, the decline of the pink tide, because we were 100,000% certain that there was no way that Donald Trump was going to become president, like most everyone else, I think. In fact, if you buy this issue, I think I made this joke the last issue release party we had, but I wrote an article called "In the Bag" that was about how the election was in the bag for Hillary Clinton. So like we can stop where it was really a very scorchingly hot take. It was a little too hot. So I've got that for the rest of my life to haunt me. But I get mocked by name in the appeal for money at the end of this issue. So if you want to buy the issue just to see me get mocked by name in print. So we were all sort of shocked and dumbfounded by this that no one really expected to see coming. But in many ways, Trump's election makes sense. I mean, we Jacobin and other folks on the left have been sounding the alarm for many years about the failures of the Democratic Party in doing much of anything, and certainly like not putting forward the kind of bold vision that could get people excited. And in this case, putting forward a bold vision, a sort of populist vision that spoke to people's pains, and that could beat the kind of noxious right-wing populism that we see in the Trump administration. So it is shocking in many ways, but it's also not that shocking given the state of the opposition in the United States. So we're going to be talking about just like what's in the issue, we're going to be talking about the horrors of Trump, how to fight back against what Trump has done, but I also think that we can't talk about Trump without talking about those failures of the Democratic Party, of the sort of neoliberal third way kind of politics. And in particular, we'll talk about, maybe we'll get to this, though. I don't think that Trump's victory was any kind of, certainly he is this incredibly just sort of buffoonishly racist and misogynist person, but I'm not sure that his election is really a resounding victory. It is a resounding sort of reflection of Americans' just deep-seated and unchangeable misogyny and racism and just badness. Like, it's possible to fight back and win against the kind of forces that Trump has helped unleash. And this as a country, us as a city in Chicago, but across the state and across the country, we're not irredeemable, full of irredeemable deplorables, I think. So we'll hopefully get into some of that. And I just mentioned before we start, I was thinking as I was writing up the intro to this that, I'm from the Midwest originally. I've lived my whole life here. Like, I don't like being like me, you look at the Democratic Party, it's in pretty rough shape right now. Hillary Clinton just lost the election. I don't like to kick people like when they're down, like I was always like taught not to do that kind of thing. And so it can seem a little mean-spirited and to have the whole conversation, especially when we've got someone like Trump in office who's doing just sheer nightmarish thing after nightmarish thing. But if we don't take stock of it, we're just going to be back where we are now in 4 years, in 8 years, in 60 years when we're all in, I don't know, prison camps or something. So that is my sort of, I guess that's just me. Yeah, exactly. Dead or death. Yeah. So that's just me, I guess, speaking to my own conscience about feeling bad for kicking Hillary Clinton while she's down. But it's a sort of necessary task, I think. So let's start, I guess, with folks, anyone who wants to respond to this, sort of your general feelings about where the country is at right now. I mean, we have folks here who are working on issues ranging from public education to anti-war activism to immigration, union organizing. How do you feel about the current state of affairs? Anybody want to start?
Well, one of my favorite quotes in the new issue is that Trump's victory is a result of a deep crisis of legitimacy. And I think we need to look at how horrid the neoliberals have been. Well, my favorite tweet that's come to Jacobin has been that every time somebody from Jacobin says neoliberal, you should have a drinking game and take a shot. But
please don't do that.
it could ruin your health. But let's look at our mayor, who has the person who ran the transit system running his schools, right? Then let's look at our national education system, and we have a woman who is wealthy because of a pyramid scheme running our schools. Let's talk about legitimacy at this level. We're not sitting here wanting the neoliberal Democrats to be better at being their horrid selves. We have a different vision for that. And my feeling is we don't want Trump to make Rahm look like the avatar for a good Democrat, right? So that's my take on what's going on.
Well, you just said a bunch of interesting stuff. We'll get into, I think, all of that in a second. Anybody else want to respond? Rory, maybe?
Okay. So I'm scared, right now. I think the overall feeling is one of tension, anxiety on a whole number of levels. Friday night is usually the night I try not to think about Trump in any capacity, so I'm sacrificing a lot.
Thank you for your service.
Yes. Free Pabst Blue Ribbon for me tonight. But if this discussion does get kind of grim throughout the evening, just remember that 1 year ago this month, we did run Trump out of the city of Chicago. And he hasn't been back since, and I think he's scared to come back. So that's a good thing. So keep that in the back of your mind, I think. But obviously this is also an opportunity. I think a lot more people are comfortable using the word socialism these days on a whole number of levels. I think there's an urgency to kind of put a radical politics forward, and it's also a great opportunity to be calling out the Democrats too. This is what the lesser evilism gets you. And so I'm motivated, I'm scared, and also very happy to be with you guys tonight. And Jack.
Robert, how are you?
So, I'm really interested, to hear what you all have to say, because I think the core issue for me is that we have to see this moment as the product of a movement, of a decades-long movement, in fact, by a conservative machine. And like Trump to me isn't a sea change. Like Micah and I kind of fight about this because I think that that conservatism is kind of running on fumes. Like I think the dude is an obvious clown, but like they're so well organized at every level of the government, much better organized than the Democrats, that they're basically able to put this thing on autopilot, lose by 3 million votes, and dude is like golden, you know? So we have to see like that there were talented organizers. We may think they're all horrible people like Jesse Helms or Reagan or and the forces that what's her name that just died, Phyllis Schlafly. Like they took. There's an article in here by Doug Hinwood where he's saying that they took the Equal Rights Amendment, something that had decades-long support, had passed in Congress, it had 30 states ratify it, and they were like, nah, it's over. They organized and stopped it, you know? So we have to see this as an organized effort, the culmination of that, decades of that, and then look at ourselves and say, what is our vision, and what organizing are we willing to commit to now? So yeah, it's certainly scary, it's certainly dire, but just like they organized to get the Republican Party to be able to take power, seize power at every level of the government, and to position themselves to be able to do so in less than a decade, or about a decade, we can do something similar.
So I'm not surprised that Donald Trump is our president. I'm not surprised that Donald Trump is our president. I felt for some time that Hillary was on a path to lose. Knocking on doors, speaking to working people, I just knew that her message that America has always been great, her message of be afraid of Donald Trump wasn't going to carry her to election. That said, I think that for some time now we've had two factions of the capitalist ruling class embodied in our two-party system. And I think that the mainstream Democratic Party represents those that think we've reached the right level of misery, right? Like, we can't go any further. And I think that you see this in the statements made by the head of Goldman Sachs, who was a big Hillary supporter, that basically said that Bernie's very dangerous, right? And we have to stick with Hillary, and we have to stick with this neoliberal party. And then we had Michael Bloomberg, right, who was a Republican who came out and endorsed Hillary. And he famously said back when Occupy Wall Street was going on that this was actually a legitimate expression of the people's dire situation and what people were facing. And then I think we have the Republicans that are just like, no, right, let's go all the way, right? Like, maybe they can get to like some weird capitalist, feudalist like society. I think they would try and get us there. And so my hope is that Trump and what he represents, that they've overplayed their hand. And the fact that you all are here, the fact that there are so many meetings and so much organizing going on right now, gives me hope in this very dark time that we're living in, that they have overplayed their hand and that they are now going to find a real resistance. That said, I'm also very scared and very anxious because Donald Trump is not going to be able to deliver on bringing back manufacturing jobs to the base that helped elect him. He's not going to be able to deliver on a lot of things. He's going to essentially continue to hand over the government to Goldman Sachs and to the rich and powerful, right? Goldman won either way, right? They were going to win with Hillary. They definitely won now. They have the Goldman Sachs cabinet under Trump. But what he can deliver on is anti-immigrant rhetoric. And I think that this is the new direction, which is nothing new, right? We've seen this in Europe, we've seen this historically, but this is the politics that they're giving us, right? So we're going to have this ultra-capitalist government, and they're going to try to maintain power and try to keep people living in misery on board with their agenda by othering vulnerable folks and making them the target of state violence.
Yeah, let's talk about that first because obviously this was very central to Trump's campaign. And obviously we were seeing a level of xenophobic rhetoric, the likes of which I think you'd be, at least in some front-runner candidate for president we haven't seen in a little while. Even if the current of that kind of xenophobia is always present in American politics. But, I mean, he ran on this, you know, says he's going to deport 11 million undocumented immigrants. And while that's maybe not feasible logistically, they're making moves, and we're hearing all kinds of stories about, you know, there was a story in the Washington Post the other day about a woman who spoke out at a press conference against Trump, and then like an hour or two later she was arrested and put into deportation proceedings. Stories about people in cities like Chicago and elsewhere, you know, raids happening, And so, like the level of immigration enforcement, I mean, it seems like it's ratcheting up. On the other hand, we just, President Obama oversaw more deportations than any president has ever carried out in his life. We're here in Chicago, and Rahm Emanuel is currently saying, he's a friend of immigrants and all these things, but when he was working in the Clinton White House, he said that immigration was the third rail of American politics. He didn't want to touch it. And I'm not sure how you feel about Rahm's his staunch immigrant rights status, but I feel like, he's just got his finger sort of in the air. So that could change at any moment. So yeah, I mean, how do we fight back against what feels like a really particularly vicious and frankly very terrifying immigration regime that we're up against?
Yeah. So I know you said not to kick people while they're down, but I gotta get. Oh, you said do it. Okay, well, I'm gonna get my pot shots. So the reality is, this was happening under Obama, right? Just as you said, but liberals were not there, right? I didn't see my white liberal friends posting articles to their Facebook about like, oh my God, this deportation happened. This is so horrible. No one was there, right? The undocumented immigrant community, a core group of the undocumented immigrant community was out there doing very radical organizing, right? Shutting down an Obama fundraiser on Michigan Avenue. Like that's intense, right? How many people have actually gone to a fundraiser of the sitting president and shut it down and disrupted that, right? Going to Obama's campaign offices and shutting that down. So there was a lot of work going on, but the broader liberal community was not there supporting them. And suddenly now everyone's there. So I'm happy that everyone is now here on board with the movement to stop deportations. But it took a Republican president doing it for the liberals to catch on. That there was a lot of suffering and state violence being done against the undocumented community. Okay, I got my pot shot. What was the rest of the question?
That's good. Well, why don't you can you talk about, I mean, that's the national scenario, but
right.
Your office in particular, you're in the 35th Ward in Chicago, and you've been doing quite a bit of work around trying to fight this stuff, at least in your ward. So can you just speak a little bit about what you're doing?
Right, so people have heard the word sanctuary. Right, and to be a sanctuary essentially means to be a safe space, right? And so this notion of being a sanctuary city has existed since the 80s. We, of course, also had the sanctuary movement, where churches were opening up their doors and housing refugees from Central America displaced by the conflicts that the U.S. was backing there, and protecting them from being deported back to their country. In the city of Chicago, we've had first an executive order brought under Harold Washington, then we had an ordinance brought forward under Mayor Daley, and then that ordinance was expanded under Mayor Rahm Emanuel. But the reality is that we're not a sanctuary, right? And we're not a sanctuary for a lot of different folks, because at its heart, we're talking about the city of Chicago being a safe space for people that are being targeted by state violence, right? And in this case, we're talking about immigration enforcement. And we're not a sanctuary, right, when we have police gunning down black people in the city of Chicago, right? We're not a sanctuary when we have the police stopping people and putting them on a gang database, right? We're not a sanctuary when we have our trans sisters and brothers being murdered with impunity. And so I, as a non-undocumented person, right, and I, as a non-black person, right, but as an elected official, believe that my role is to listen to those being directly impacted and to bring forth their demands. And so what I'm hearing from activists on the ground is that if we really want to be a sanctuary, we need to expand what that means, right? And it needs to not just be we're going to protect immigrants, but it also needs to be that we're going to also protect everyone from state violence. So it means getting the police out of the Chicago public schools, right? It means things like defunding the police, right? It means things like decriminalizing, right? So that we have less people being arrested. And one of the key things that we have to understand about how this connects back to the traditional sense of sanctuary is that the criminal justice system is the primary way in which the federal government finds people to deport, right? So anytime a Chicago police officer goes out and harasses a street vendor and arrests them, right, we're not a sanctuary, right? Because this person now has a criminal record, and according to Donald Trump, they're now a priority for deportation. And let's make one thing clear. For Donald Trump, every undocumented immigrant, every immigrant is a criminal. The executive orders that he's passed have literally taken prosecutorial discretion, have taken the ability to look at immigrants case by case and determine who is a priority under this fucked up dichotomy of criminal, non-criminal. It's literally taken that out the window, and it literally just says, everyone's a criminal, Quite honestly, that is what his new executive order says. It says, if we even suspect that you may have committed a crime, well, working on a fake social security number that you made up is a crime under federal law, right? And so to Donald Trump, every single person that is in this country as an immigrant is a criminal. I think that that's a key part of his fascist right-wing program. And so what we as a city need to do then is we need to make sure that we're putting forward that bold alternative. And unfortunately, I think that the city of Chicago has shown that we're very conservative when it comes to policing. So I guess the key point I'm trying to make here is that immigration enforcement and local policing are one and the same, right? They represent the police state that we have present in the United States. And the city of Chicago, even though it's controlled by Democrats, we have one of the highest police officers, one of the highest rates of police officers per capita. So we have about 43 police officers per 10,000 residents. That's double LA, double Houston. Houston's comparable to us in size, yet we have more crime. And we also spend 40 cents of every dollar that the city budget allocates on policing. And so we are a law and order city, right? We're a law and order city. And the great irony is that we're actually an example of the type of law enforcement policies that the right wing loves to hold up, yet it's not addressing safety, right? And so we have to think really clearly about who do we want to keep safe as a city, and historically the role of the police has been to keep the capitalist class safe, right? To keep their property safe, to keep their wealth safe. And so let's then keep ourselves and our beloved community safe, right? So let's put forward policies that keep black people safe, that keep immigrants safe, that keep trans folks safe, that keep workers safe. And so this is now the demand that we're making of Mayor Rahm Emanuel and Democrats in control of the city council is let's be a real sanctuary city in every sense of the word. And let's create those policies that are actually going to keep our residents of our city safe.
Can folks here in the back, by the way, are we loud enough? Or is everyone hearing us? Yeah, good? Okay. Speaking of our mayor, let's talk about public education. Michelle, you alluded to this in your opening statements about we've got this Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, who has this really absolutely vicious agenda on public ed. I mean, privatization, vouchers to take public money and give to religious schools or to cyber charters or to whatever school you want to create in your shed in the backyard, like whatever. And she wants to destroy teachers' unions, more charters. She wants all of it, basically. But really, all of those things are not that different from what we've seen under the Democratic Party. I mean, attacking teachers' unions, expanding charter schools, expanding privatization of education. Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, I found this out recently, was on a board with Betsy DeVos that was dedicated to spreading vouchers in schools in America. So peas in a pod there. So how do you deal with that? I mean, when there's really, it's only like a barely 1 or 2 shades of difference between the two parties on this issue.
Only 1 or 2 shades. And I'd like to respond to some things that Carlos said. I thank the higher power or God for the Chicago Teachers Union every day. And I think this city should too, because we're holding our city's schools together with glue. And they're being held together by an overworked workforce that is having trouble on their work site because of the way the bosses are running our schools. And Carlos called it a law and order city, and the money that's being spent on police. We are really horrid at funding and running our schools in this city. And we have not made it a priority whatsoever. And think about violence that's going on right now. And we have been threatened with a school closing on June 1st. When do most of the crimes against youth and with youth happen in our city? The hot months of summer. So how could our mayor and Forrest Claypool look all of us in the eye and say, it's a crisis, we can't do anything, there's no money to be had anywhere, and we would like 3 more weeks of our children not in school. And we will also not be having summer school. it's the Chicago Teachers Union that fights against this. And I know that contractually we cannot fight against furloughs. It is state law about budgeting. It is outside of the realm of what we can negotiate about contractually, but we can still fight it, and we will. So I wanted to respond to that because we're in a desperate situation in our schools, and our schools are the cornerstones with which we can make our neighborhoods places of peace and places of sanctuary and solace for our children. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, though, was you were talking about feudalism, and I think we're there. I think that we're living in a capitalist Chicago, but I also think we're living in a feudal Chicago with lots of little fiefdoms. And if you think about 13th century England, Rom is the sheriff of Nottingham in the Robin Hood story. And
does the CTU Robin Hood then?
I hope so. But when we look at the Jacobin issue, there's a real highlight on Donald Trump as a real estate developer. And I think we need to think about the land grab that's happening in Chicago as well, especially with the closings of schools, debilitating a neighborhood, taking the housing prices way down low, putting up the fancy new charter school that's brand spanking new. All of Rom's friends have already bought the property around that school, and the new developments goes up. You know, the closings of school are not about right-sizing the school system. They're not about children are failing and our schools are toxic. We're looking at highway robbery and real estate grabs. And so when we also think that door was opened for that type of transitioning of power by the Democrats, but now we have Betsy DeVos wheedling her way in, and the door was open, and she stepped in, and she went farther, and the funding of the use of tax dollars to fund religious schools and homeschooling and anybody who calls themselves a school is really a frightening adventure, because education is what we all need right now in order for us to wedge in this space that's been created for us to have this new vision of what we want to go on. So thank you for that.
So you are this, your union is the real bright spot on the national scene, really. I mean, you know, I write a lot about labor, and every article that is on labor seems like things are really bad for the labor movement, really bad, really bad. But there are signs of hope, like Chicago Teachers Union and Chicago Teachers Union. So you all are doing very important organizing on the local level, but you're part of a national union, the American Federation of Teachers. It was recently announced the American Federation of Teachers president, Randy Weingarten, was going on some sort of listening tour with Betsy DeVos after this incident in which some parent activists blocked Betsy DeVos from accessing a school in Washington, D.C. as a kind of photo op opportunity. And apparently Randy Weingarten felt very bad for Betsy DeVos about this because they're not going on a listening tour together. So what's your reaction to that?
It's very hard to fight on so many fronts. Are you feeling this personally also? We're fighting the Democrats. We're fighting Trumpism and its madness. But as a trustee of our Chicago Teachers Union, we're also fighting our national union, and they do us great harm. And we've pushed her and pushed her, yet pushing's not enough. We need to reorganize, and there have to be ways to overtake our national unions if we can. But nothing beats good grassroots solid organizing. You know, this is the scene. Betsy DeVos, the new Secretary of Education, trots up to Jefferson Middle School in D.C. The D.C. teachers are quite radicalized as well. And they had told parents, they had told students, and there was a protest, and they blocked the entrance to the school. And Randy Weingarten's knee-jerk reaction was to tweet out that the Secretary of Education had every right to be there, that those parents shouldn't have blocked her, and she also said that it had been somewhat aggressive. You know, aren't you tired of knee-jerk tweets? This is the president of the American Federation of Teachers. Could she taken a few moments before being reactionary? You know, what we're seeing is people wanting to be so on top of things and so in the moment that they're not even taking a minute to be critical and to analyze this. Those parents had every right to stop a white, wealthy woman from coming into their school and using their children as and for a labor leader to not understand that analysis, it's heartbreaking. So, I got a little speechy, didn't I? But, so I think we are the ones who are thinking deeply. We are the ones who are analyzing. We need to stick together through this, and we need to call people out when they've done nothing other than say something stupid just to get attention.
Let's move on to Rory. Everything that's happening right now is terrifying, but on the war front in particular, really worrisome stuff. I mean, Trump was this interesting guy when he was running, right? That he had this weird mix of like isolationism with sort of hyper macho, you know, chest beating, and he's going to build up our failing nuclear, you know, arsenal, which is really just in rough shape. We can only blow up the world like 7,000 times over, so we have to make that great again. This week in particular, Trump's speech to Congress when he, I'm a pretty even-keeled guy, but when I was watching the speech and he did the whole thing about the Navy SEAL who died in the raid in Yemen, I was just like, yeah! Like, this was a raid that Trump ordered over dinner, right? That essentially, according to the New York Times, he ordered, the military advisors were like, well, Obama didn't have big enough balls to go in to do this raid in Yemen, but you do, right, President Trump? And he's like, yes, I do, and he signs the paper. So, and then we end up with this guy. He leads to this Navy SEAL's death, as well as the deaths of 30 people in Yemen, including an 8-year-old American citizen. And then somehow, because even though Trump ordered this raid that led to this guy's death, we get to have the whole pomp and circumstance of him celebrating this, and as if he, Trump reaps for this political benefit rather than saying, why did you order this horrible raid that killed all these people, including this Navy SEAL? So that worried me on the level that, like, he realized that he can get a lot of traction essentially from the dead bodies of soldiers. Would you agree with me on that? I mean, is that a thing that we should be looking for in the future? That, like, Trump realizing, oh, like I can get pretty far when I send people in to die on things like this, and I can become the hero.
So you didn't find that to be the moment where he became presidential? Yeah, I mean, it was clearly opportunistic, propagandistic, all of those things to divert attention from the fact that we're embroiled in an endless war. This happened in a country that we're officially, not at war with, too, by the way. What was most troubling was kind of the Democratic response to it. How quick they were to kind of latch onto this. Yes, the system is legitimate. Look, he did this thing that all the other presidents have done previously too, exploited dead soldiers in order to legitimize illegal, endless wars. So, obviously it made your skin crawl watching it, but it was also something that has been done by Obama, Clinton, Bush, down the line. So yeah, it was quite horrible, and it was also against the wishes of his father too. So his father was outraged by the fact that he said this mission was something worth doing. Trump is clearly feeling a little bit of sting from this Yemen raid. He now wants to apparently give General Mathis the authority to sign off on these raids. Which does happen in actual theaters in places where technically at war. I don't know what countries are we actually at war with, but under Obama, who was quite the micromanager, he was signing off on all of these raids, and now but Trump wants to give this authority over to Mathis, so he can kind of not have responsibility for it. But I think it's important to highlight the fact that in 2015 alone, Obama signed off on military operations in 150 countries throughout the world last year. That's 76% of all the countries in the world. The U.S. military has conducted raids, had military operations, and so this is kind of the legacy that Trump is inheriting. We have 800 military bases around the world. I think Obama in 2016 alone dropped 3 bombs in every hour, every day for the entire year, which is like 27,000 bombs. Incidentally, in all the countries that Trump is trying to ban, too, in those 7 countries. So, it's propaganda. The U.S. has a $700 million a year advertising budget that it uses to recruit kids around the country. 10,000 recruiters, roam the hallways across the country trying to get the next generation of cannon fodder, essentially, to go off and kind of do the bidding of the 1%.
So what have your conversations looked like with these students who you're talking to in Chicago public schools? I mean, you were telling me that you go into these schools, you talk to kids who you said have only heard great things about the military, right? And how do they view it, and how do they view their place in the war machine or not? How do they respond to the pitch from these recruiters?
So they see it as an opportunity it's either the school to prison pipeline or it's the school to the military pipeline in a lot of instances for these kids. With cost of education soaring, this is an opportunity to pay for college, an opportunity to learn leadership skills, because that's what is touted. It's like pulling teeth trying to get in these schools to talk to these kids, because administration, less so teachers, but they see this as a positive thing to provide structure and discipline in extremely poor communities. And so it's sad, but when you talk to these kids about the last 15 years, they can't tell you anything about the 1 million people that we've killed, 80% being civilians since 2011. They don't know anything about that. They don't know, that we're only in these countries to control other countries' natural resources and have spheres of influence in these places. So it's very disheartening. Their experience with the military is movies and Call of Duty, and I always get is the military like Call of Duty? I was like, do you kill 80% of the people you kill in Call of Duty? Are they innocent? No. Do women and children cry as they watch their fathers get killed or their brothers or their babies get killed in front of them in Call of Duty? No. Can you turn off Call of Duty? Yeah. Well, you can't turn off war if you've actually been there, and you need to think about these things. And I don't go in there to finger wag. It's just about full disclosure, because these kids don't get the full picture. And regardless of what I tell these kids, they're probably going to go off anyway. Because it's their only hope in a lot of ways. But it's definitely something to be addressed. Just last thing, in his in his defense budget, he's going to Trump is going to allocate $56 billion to defense, which only goes back to 2011 levels. We've been here at this. Everybody's acting outraged, as rightly so. But he wants to include 75,000 more active duty soldiers on the ground. So that means they're going to be preying on these kids more intensely, going forward. And so that's kind of.
And lastly, do you think? We had Obama, who was ramping up a lot of these operations in countries like Yemen, but the kind of broad anti-war movement that that failed to stop the war in Iraq, but at least was in the streets in huge numbers under President Bush, and that movement disappeared under President Obama, despite all of the really grotesque things he was doing on foreign policy. What are your feelings about, briefly, about the prospects for a kind of renewed anti-war movement in the United States?
I think I think, you know, because he's so ham-fisted and obnoxious on how he deals with these things, he's going to, you know, the foreign policy bureaucracies are pretty entrenched. And, you know, he does have broad-ranging powers, but I think I see a lot of the same policies being carried out under Trump that were carried out under Obama, just a little bit more reckless. So I do think it's an opportunity, you know. But Obama was certainly the movement killer, you know, in so many different ways. Carlos was talking about it, you know, a little bit, but I do think, you know, there's opportunity, and I hope it doesn't take some tragic war. You know, I mean, you have a bunch of Iran hawks, crazy Iran hawks in this administration that are just like chafing at the bit to start a war with Iran. I mean,
well, Flynn's really only accomplishment before he was given the boot was when he came out at the press conference with Sean Spicer and said, Iran is on notice, right?
On notice.
What a bright star that burned out so quickly. That's one thing he did.
But The Intercept just reported that Mathis was going to try to board an Iranian ship off the coast of Saudi Arabia that he thought might have arms for Houthi rebels in Saudi Arabia. So that would have been an international crisis. But at the last minute, he's like, well, I think there might be a leak, so I'm not going to do it. But he was all for it, you know. Pompeo, you know, he wants to roll back the Iran deal. They all want to roll, you know. So hopefully it doesn't take that to, you know, kick off the anti-war movement that this country desperately needs right now.
RL, all this stuff is very bleak. There's no getting around that. But you were telling me that you think that in some ways, you know, the task at hand maybe feels more urgent, but in terms of what the movement agenda needs to look like, isn't all that different than it was, you know, pre-November. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I went back to election night. You know, or let's go back to it for a second. Like, who is all right? Raise your hand if you're like devastated. Were you just destroyed? Who was destroyed? It's just like on the ground, like, right? I personally, my jaw was on the ground. I was like, what? Like I was like, I really thought Beyonce had it in the background, you know. But the day after the election, I went into an industrial kitchen with the union, and we were talking to people who make the food that goes onto airplanes, airline catering. And I was talking to this dishwasher, and she had like a scar on her neck, like a knife injury. So, like, she's working at this low-wage job. She's clearly been through some very real things in her life, right? So I'm talking to her, and I ask her, all right, how much do you think you should make? And she says, well, my job's not important. I should make, I don't know, like $8 an hour, okay? So I'm like, you know, in the moment when you're talking to people who have jobs and are in deep poverty and dealing with all of the things that we're talking about here, you know, I'm having conversations with them one-on-one, trying to create the impetus to change some of this in one way. It's heavy a lot of the time, and it was heavy the day before the election, weeks before the election, and it was heavy, you know, the day after. And so I talked to her, and I'm like, okay, but what would happen if you didn't do your job, if you didn't wash any of the dishes here? And she's like, well, none of the food would go on the planes. And I was like, all right, then what would happen if none of the food goes on the planes? And she's like, well, the company loses, you know, millions of dollars. And I was like, okay, then what's your job worth? You know? So we were able, through that conversation, we were able to get her to $25 an hour. So that's it's not full communism, but what I learned in that moment was, okay, we're talking about these issues structurally and at a policy level, but the people on the ground don't feel a lot of hope. So we can argue over, like, okay, these things are different, these things are different, these things are the same, and that's cool at a policy level to a degree. But one of the things that's the same is that people living in these conditions don't have any expectation that their lives will change, regardless of what other technocratic shifts happen at the elite level. And so, how do we begin to seize people there at a place of hopelessness? Well, I think that what we have to do is actually provide vision and hope. And so, yes, it was devastating when I'm like talking straight to you. I'll spread the wealth. It was, of course, devastating, you know, when Trump was elected. And I understand, you know, people, when I went back to work the next day, like, people were like, oh my God, like they were in the dumps. But my union is actually, I work for Unite Here. The union is one of the only unions that is fighting Trump. Like, he's the boss at our casinos. So like, and have beat him. So there's hope in real people in motion. And I think all the stories that you've heard up here are about, like, little moments of people talking to people, people coming together to do real things, to change the margins from the ground up. And I think that mission is still the same. And I also think that, like, what's honest, though, I said that hope and vision are necessary. What's honest is to actually stand up and have a vision and not just criticize the Democrats for failing to live to a standard, but also really staunchly stand on the standard and then back that up with the organizing necessary to realize it. I think a lot of the time, especially on the internet, there's all these, like, ridiculous fights about Syria, for example. Like people are losing jobs, losing friendships over Syria, right? And I'm like, okay, none of you have the ability to implement this political line. There's no ability, there's no organizing behind any of this. So what are we really doing here besides killing each other over this abstract line? So when are we going to get back to actually doing the organizing necessary to win? And I think that looks like a lot of the things that we've heard on this panel here. And I would hope that we focus on that. Last thing I'll say is, think back to, like, slavery, right? Yeah, I'm bringing up slavery. The differences between, like, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan and whatever, who even knows who those people are, you know what I mean? Those are presidents of the United States, right? In the lead up to the Civil War. The technical differences between the two of them didn't, for the abolitionists, shift the actual vision of abolishing slavery and doing the organizing necessary to win that political victory. And I think we have to have a similar view. Like, all right, Trump is going to go to the dustbin of history straight up 100 years from now. But what's really going to matter is, did we seize the moment to develop a vision and push it through to its conclusion? That's the moment that we have right now, and that's what the conservatives did, you know, and that's why they're winning. And so we have to have a similar attitude. So,
well, let's turn it over to folks on the floor. You know, people always say, "Oh, only do a question, don't do a comment." I'm fine with your comment if you want to make a comment, but I'm going to cut you off at 90 seconds, and if it feels longer than 90 seconds, I'm going to cut you off too. Just know that. Okay. Yeah, sure.
So I was interested in hearing from you all, maybe so I've seen a little bit as far as labor movement activity, labor unions specifically, especially the teachers, CTU, kind of pushing for some action against Trump, but then what you talked about of other unions kind of pulling back and not necessarily directly confronting this issue, you know, I mean, maybe talk just a little bit more about what we need to do if some of the unions aren't fighting. I mean, I know the trade unions are clearly, there's some issues there, and then also some others going on. You know, what can be done? Because, I mean, right now it seems like the ACLU is, you know, kind of stepping up in a lot of ways. Not to get too off, but just Thomas Gagan, which side are you on? I remember him mentioning that, you know, if the ACLU fights for various things as far as, like, civil rights, you know, eventually it seems like in America you can get a little bit pushed on that, but if you ever try to introduce economic justice into the equation, it's like, no, you know, pulling teeth. And it's not that it's not pulling teeth on ACLU stuff either, and I'm grateful for the movement, but how do we get unions to make that argument as well, and to say we need economic reorganization?
Well, our unions are kind of screwed up. And you know, the vision of what unions can do for workers is not what's actually in fact, right? And let's take a look at the Chicago Federation of Labor. You know, that's some racist bullshit that goes on right there, because the
Shots fired.
Shots fired. And part of it is, you know, it's one of the things that we're fighting about is it's dads who are keeping jobs for their sons and keeping other people out. And so then we have horrible schools that don't train our kids in the trades and without any facilities. And it just perpetuates this keeping my own. And I think what we saw with Trump was a lot of workers holding on desperately to their own, and that's not the vision we have as unionists. It's the type of social movement unionism that we want to practice is something that we're working really hard to perpetuate other places. I'm the president of something called UCOR, which is 22 other caucuses just like ours. I have to stay pretty narrow in education because, like I said, we are fighting our own parent unions in this, but I hope that the vision of justice inside our union can be one that other people can model.
But and just so for folks who don't know the story, I mean, you are part of the caucus who you had to fight within your own union in order to make it what it is today, right? Which
And
is
still.
what, and still, you have a caucus full of people who are just activists of the union who are frustrated with the fact that the union wasn't delivering on that kind of social movement unionism agenda, right?
But think about how much money and power is in the hands of these unions. It really is ours to harness, in my mind.
You know, Michelle once told me that she wrote a paper that was on social movement unionism, and your professor said, this was a lot like the language in the Wikipedia article for social movement unionism. And you said, yeah, I wrote the Wikipedia article. So if you want to know what social movement unionism is, you can read Wikipedia. And Michelle wrote the page for it. Any other reflections on that?
I'd say, I think what we really need is, so I went to Carleton in Minnesota. It's in the middle of nowhere. And I had no meaningful connection or engagement with any kind of base building or deep organizing when I was there. Like it was marketed to me as like this school that Paul Wellstone used to be a professor at, and like, oh, we have this like liberal. This is back when I was a liberal. Tradition and like all this stuff. But when I got to the campus, I was pretty isolated. One of the things that's cool about a city like Chicago is that there are lots of opportunities for students and for a variety of people to actually get involved in union organizing. And I think one of the most important things that we can do now is to create pipelines for people to actually be rank and file members of unions. And because without that base, you can't actually have any sort of shift in union practice. Like, I as a staffer in the union am not going to be able to shift it like that. There's certain structural limitations. Like, people were like talking about the general strike coming up, like, why aren't the unions doing it? Well, there's like lawsuits and like they don't want like all the assets seized, and you know, it's like a very the structural limitations on the union are very severe. The only way to actually change that, or to build the courage necessary to change how unions act in society, is to change the equation that unions are making their calculations with, to change like the motion happening in society, and to create pipelines to the rank and file of politicized people, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about the caucus and the CTU. So it has to come from below. So I would think that if we really wanted to talk about changing unions, we have to become union members. And it's kind of impossible to do that. And we also need to build a SALT program as part of like political training for anybody who wants to be a communist or a socialist or whatever, that it's like really important to, I don't know, like talk to workers and learn how to actually organize with workers. So I would advise that.
There's a little plug, a long article about salting, the history of salting, and why it's a good thing, why more people should do it. Jacobinmag.com. Anyone else have a question here? Sure, yeah.
My question is just your thoughts or takes on what happened last weekend when the Democratic Party voted in Perez to be chair, and kind of what that means for all the issues that we're talking about. So.
Did everybody hear the question about the DNC chair race from a week ago when Tom Perez was made the chair? Carlos, you want to respond?
Yeah, so I'm a Bernie bro. But I think that the Democratic Party is still addicted to corporate America's money. The Democratic Party is still addicted to corporate America's money. And I don't think that we're going to see the party as a whole change until we change who's actually in the party. So we have these things called state central committeemen, right? So in the Democratic primary that's coming up in March of 2018, we will elect the people that will essentially decide who is actually the Democratic Party, what is the Democratic Party about at the state level, and then inform the national level by voting for things like who's the DNC chair. So obviously I'm extremely disappointed that Keith Ellison did not win. I think it was a major lost opportunity to harness the political revolution that Senator Sanders put forward through his candidacy to move the party to the left. Obviously a lot of it was going to be symbolic, right? There's very little that the DNC chair can actually change. But so to me what it reflects is, one, we still have the neoliberals in there. But it does reflect, and this is what some of my more neoliberal apologist friends have told me is, well, look, the only way that they could keep control of the party is by putting forward Tom Perez, who is one of the more progressive left members of their faction, right? And that was the only way, that literally by putting forward this Latino candidate who has a record that is very much pro-labor, that was the only way that they could win. So that does show that they're slowly learning. I do think, however, that we need to teach them a lesson right away. And I will say this. I hear a lot of folks talk about a third party. The vast majority of folks that are talking about a third party have never done serious electoral work. And I can tell you that the amount of power that we would have to build a viable third party, we would be able to change the Democratic Party's entire platform. We would be able to change the entire Democratic Party's name, logo, 3 times over by the time we built enough party power.
Password to the Twitter account.
Exactly. We would have it all 3 times over by the time we would be able to build a viable third party. And so I think similar to what other folks have said, we need to meet folks where they're at. And unfortunately, we have a huge swath of the working class that will just vote for that Democratic label. And by the time that you get them to a place where they're going to say, hey, I'm going to vote for the Workers' Party or for whatever you call it, you would have already taken over the Democratic Party. So my sense is, let's give it a shot. We got the March 2018 primaries coming up. Let's primary them. Let's teach them a lesson. Let's make them really afraid. And it's going to be really fun.
Well, I'm sure there are many people in this room who would like to strenuously disagree with some of the things you just said. I'm sure maybe we can have that full discussion later. But there is the question of like what it means. I mean, what everything we saw in this recent election cycle means about the nature of the Democratic Party. That perhaps that in some ways it is not a party that you can just sort of grab hold of by showing up. That maybe like in its bones it is this kind of pro-corporate party that while you may be able to occasionally win a victory from someone like Ellison or even Bernie, that it maybe in the bones of the party it might be a sort of capitalist party, that it's always going to be that way, right?
Well, so I will say this: I love Kshama Sawant. I love what she's done in Seattle.
Kshama Sawant is the socialist city council member in Seattle. Right?
And yes, and I think that it depends on the local law and the local polity. So you can pull that off in Seattle because the law is structured in such a way that you can do that. But in places like Illinois, it's extremely difficult to get ballot access for a third party. And again, the electorate is just so focused on this brand of Democrat that when you come to them with something else, you say, hey, JK, you should actually vote for this thing, they're going to be like, It's going to take a really long time to get them there. So, look, the Democratic Party is made up of individuals, right? And individuals are, right? They're not these, like, one of the things that I often struggle with is people, like, the moment that you become like a politician, you're no longer a human being. No. Politicians are human beings. They have the same motivations that you do. They want to keep their jobs. They want to advance in their career. They want to be liked. They want to be able to go home and cuddle with someone at night, maybe. So the thing is, you have to understand that these individuals, right, understand that right now their career advancement is based upon kissing corporate America's ass, right? Getting those campaign contributions. And I'll tell you another thing too. Corporate America is very good in terms of solidarity and taking care of their own. If you're a Democratic politician, you sell out to them and you lose re-election, guess what? They have a job for you. And it'll probably pay you better than your public sector job. So I think that we need to be aware of those variables and ensure that we put our people in there. The same thing with, I mean, isn't that what Teamsters for Democratic Union has been trying to do for Teamsters for years? Right? There's this institution. We need it. It needs to be part of our victory plan. And so let's try and get our people in there. And I think that we can get our people in there. And again, if you want to do a third party, do that. But I'm going to spend my time on trying to take over the Democrats.
Rory, maybe briefly?
Yeah, just briefly, because this is definitely a discussion for later. But I find the Democratic Party totally unredeemable, and something that has failed us time and time again. It's completely corporate owned. I just think it's a shell of a party right now, and I think, why not? You know, there's 100, of the 350 million people who live in this country, 150 didn't vote for either candidate. And I think there's a huge opportunity. I mean, just what if, Bernie decided to, after he lost, to break off and run as an independent. He could have been, maybe have won the election, I think, based on the amount of people he was drawing out. Bernie, I mean, but the Democrats did everything possible to sabotage the thing. And if you want to, rebuild within the Democratic Party, there's so much baggage that you just have to either ignore and pretend won't resurface. I just think it makes more sense to start from the ground up, recognize all the people that are completely feel disenfranchised by both parties, and then trust ourselves to build something that's actually democratic and represents the interests of everybody.
This conversation will probably go on for the rest of our lives. Anybody else want to have a question back here? Yeah, Laura?
Yeah, I was a Bernie bro too. Whether or not people want to start an independent party, or whether or not they want, I agree Democrats are not redeemable, but they are a takeover of both, I believe. But anyway, wherever side you fall, why has public funded elections fallen off the radar? And I was very disappointed in Bernie that he started off his campaign talking about, it was part of his platform, public funded elections. Then I heard him about halfway through. I wasn't hearing it at his rallies. And at his rallies, his speeches were the same every damn time. So it's like, why am I not hearing this now? And he even said, I don't think we have a chance, politically for this. And I'll tell you, the times I've talked with conservatives about any other issue, I always bridge to public funded elections, and we agree. We agree. So I think this is an issue no matter, why is it falling off the radar of progressives? Anyone have an idea?
Yeah, let's take one or two more, and then we can get answers to multiple questions. Yeah, Mike?
I'm Mike. Like Rory, I'm in the ISO, the International Socialist Organization. If it was just the election, just like everyone else on the panel, I would still probably be in my bed right now. I probably would not have gotten out for this. But being part of the Women's March on January 21st and being part of the airport protests and all the resistance since then has really made me feel like, okay, there's something going on. It's not just continuous sort of defeats and everything going on. So what Rosa was saying, what Carlos Rosa was saying, not only do we need legislation and things like that can proclaim us a sanctuary city, we need to put ourselves out there. We need to be part of it. I live in Rogers Park, and I just signed up to be part of an emergency response network that can respond to deportations as they happen. To be out there, to put our bodies on the line to stop these things as they happen, right? I mean, that's really where change comes. So I think everyone should plug into what they can. Everyone in this room should be in a socialist organization, I think. Whether it be DSA, ISO, Solidarity, whatever, but get involved, because I mean we make the change, right? We put that out there, and yeah, I mean this is exciting. I think 6 months ago this room would have been a third the size, but now there's this many people coming out excited to do things, and we can definitely. This is a crucial moment to change things, and I think the center has dropped out. The right and the left are now sort of like competing for influence and for power, and I mean it's a moment for us too.
Anybody else?
I have a bit of a cheesy question. Hi. I think though that each of you do you're organizing though day to day, going out and talking to people and having the conversations, and I don't know, I would feel lucky if you could share a little bit about those moments where you see folks change, in those conversations. Why not share? I would love to know.
Yeah, anybody respond to any of those questions or comments?
Well, I have a 15-year-old nephew. I'm gonna show him this video later, so shout out to David. My nephew, a month ago or something like that, he's like, Unc, how do I start a movement? And I was like, he texted me this, and I was like, yes! Biggie Smalls is in the game! Yes! So I think people have changed just by watching the news and seeing things happening. But at the same time, there's a lot of fear and paranoia going on too. And a lot of people on our side have kind of stoked that as well. There were all these cut and pasted Facebook things there's a raid happening here, there's a raid happening, and some of that's not good, and it breeds disorganization. But I think, in my actual time, actually organizing with people on a one-on-one basis. So the same kitchen that I went into, the morale was really low in this kitchen. It was bad news. But one thing that people were excited about, they were excited to fight Trump. People hate this dude. So I think there is a light that comes on in people's eyes when you talk about him. Whether that be my 15-year-old nephew who's hyped to oppose, he was like, Betsy DeVille is trying to steal my education, he was hype about that, or in the
mixture of Betsy DeVos and Cruella DeVille.
That's right.
Someone mean that.
Yeah, David coined it. You heard? David coined it. That's happening in the atmosphere, but at the same time, I also have seen, somebody, there was a worker whose brother got killed on the south side, right? And she tried to take off work and got disciplined by her job the next day for trying to take off work after her brother had been killed, And so, again, there's this excitement happening, but it's also the same kinds of misery that people are going through on a day-to-day basis. And so the question that I'm having in the struggle is, how do I actually, not just as a union staffer, but I mean more generally, how do we actually meet people there with hope? And not just hope for no reason, but backed by actual organizing. And that's true. The unions are not necessarily in the position to really do a lot of that work. And we're talking about socialist organizations, and what's that going to look like? I'm not sure. Or whether that's going to be in the Democratic Party or outside of it. But I do know that most people in the working class did not vote. I was one of them. But look, that's where we are, and we got to actually meet people there and build something with a real vision. So I'm excited to see that, because that's what people want. That's when you're going to see the change, is in the conversations when you have something real to say, and not just regurgitate a bunch of nonsense.
Anybody else?
I think we're talking about vision here, and getting lefties to unite is kind of hard. I've been there. But I think there's some things that we can agree on. And that the Democrats kept talking about global economy, and that we had to get ready for the 21st century, and there's all of this movement and agitation around it. And now we have Trump with America First. I think every single one of us in this room can unite around the idea that they're both the same thing, right? They're both perpetuation of capitalism. And we don't want 21st century learning for our kids. What we want is critical pedagogy and pedagogy of liberation. We want them to be people who fight for what's right for workers and what's right for themselves, and that's the great piece that I think can unite us. So I think what we have to do is take the vision of what we're doing in our small places, in military, in union organizing, in education, in politics, and keep talking about class struggle. And keep talking in terms of class-based school struggle and what it means in terms of schooling.
So I want to uplift a couple of things that Michelle said, right? That notion of being overwhelmed, right? Like there's just too many things, and that's a lot of what I'm hearing. Like there's just so much going on. This administration is throwing so much at us, and people don't know what to do. They don't know if they're acting strategically. And I guess one of the things that I want to kind of draw out is that we don't all need to be on the same page in terms of our strategy, right? Because we're not all going to be able to do the same thing, right? And so I made it clear, like I think strategically that the best thing to do in terms of creating a workers' party is to do that within the Democratic Party in the state of Illinois. But absolutely, if you want to work on a third party, if you want to create a third-party workers' party, please do that. And I want you to be successful, right? I don't think that that's a strategy, but if you think that's a strategy, do it. And at the same time, I also think that we need multiple strategies, right? So one of the things we're doing in the 35th Ward is, right, I'm putting forward policies that are connected to the grassroots, right? These are demands that the community is coming up with. But we're also organizing autonomous groups outside of the state. It's a little bit weird, right? Because I'm part of the state and we're using resources of the state, but we're literally helping to organize the community into a deportation defense committee, right? Where people will say this is an alternative to 911. This is an alternative to the actual mechanisms of the state protecting us because we're going to protect ourselves. So I think that in this moment in time we need to pursue multiple strategies because otherwise we're going to become overwhelmed. We're not all going to be able to do the same thing. We're not all going to agree on the thing that needs to be done, but we need to go do something. And I never thought I was going to say this, but yeah, maybe some of y'all should go salt with Unite Here.
I think we should probably wrap it up. Do folks have any closing thoughts they want to share for episode?
As far as like people changing, I could say that I was a Republican through my 20s, and like Rocky, after Rocky IV, if I can change, you can change. Everybody can change. I've always just wanted to close on that.
That's beautiful. That's perfect. Well, thanks again, everyone, for coming. I'm sure we can continue some of these discussions. Please buy New Issue from John in the back there. Please tip your bartender, Jen, assistant editor at Jacobin, and we will immediately tear down this room and bring in the DJ, and we'll get lit. So, thank you.